It was the opening moments of June 6, 1944, just after midnight. North of Carrington in Normandy, the night hung heavy and still. Obergefreiter Rudolf Thiel's hands shook as he brought the match to his cigarette, his eyes straining against the thick darkness that blanketed the Norman landscape. Then came the sound, low at first, almost imperceptible, but growing with each passing moment. Aircraft engines, hundreds of them. The drone swelled into a roar that split the silence, and Thiel understood instantly what it meant. Within minutes, he would be frantically turning the crank on his field telephone, his voice urgent and sharp, reporting what would become the largest airborne assault ever launched in human history. At precisely 0011 hours, his message crackled through the German command network. That single report would trigger the collapse of an entire intelligence apparatus. In the hours that followed, 13,348 American paratroopers would descend into the Norman darkness. Behind them came nearly 4,000 American glider troops, along with thousands more from Britain and Canada. All were landing directly behind German lines, and the German High Command had seen nothing coming. On paper, at least, Germany's defensive forces looked formidable. The 91st Luftlander Infantry Division, commanded by General Wilhelm Falle, held the Central Peninsula with 12,000 men. General Karl Wilhelm von Schleben's 709th Static Infantry Division defended the eastern coast, where they would soon face the Americans at Utah Beach, their ranks numbering over 12,000. The veteran 352nd Infantry Division under General Dietrich Kreis controlled the sector containing Omaha Beach, commanding roughly 12,000 troops. But the real strength lay elsewhere. Germany's own elite paratroopers, the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, had been positioned to reinforce the defense. These 4,500 men, commanded by Major Friedrich August Freiherr von der Heydter, represented some of the finest trained soldiers in the Wehrmacht. Most were barely 17 and a half years old, yet their training and discipline made them formidable opponents. The High Command had anticipated an airborne assault might come. Field Marshal Rommel himself had obsessed over the beaches, ordering the installation of over 1 million wooden obstacles to be driven into the soil across potential landing zones throughout Normandy. Standing between 4 and 5 meters tall, spaced roughly 25 to 30 meters apart, these poles would become known as Rommel's asparagus. They were designed to shred parachutes and cripple gliders. By April, just one sector had seen the erection of more than 900,000 such stakes. Yet Rommel was not there that night. He was in Germany with his wife celebrating her birthday. The weather seemed impossible for an invasion. Surely nothing would come in these conditions. At 7 minutes past midnight, the reality crashed down on Obergefreiter Gunther Prignitz of the 13th Company, Fallschirmjäger Regiment 6. He was stationed at St. Georges de Beaune when the ground erupted in chaos. His tent jerked from the concussion of nearby explosions and shouts. An alert had gone up. Paratroopers, gliders. Prignitz stumbled into the darkness and found an American hanging from a massive tree, one leg clearly broken, crying out in English. The paratrooper was moaning, and Prignitz disarmed him with care, speaking as calmly as he could. Later, Prignitz would recall the moment with strange clarity. This American, dangling in agony from the tree, was likely the first prisoner of war taken on the beaches of Normandy. Similar scenes were unfolding across the German positions. Eugen Grieser, serving in the 2nd Battalion, would describe the captured Americans he encountered in stunned terms. They were mostly young men, 20 years old or so, big and strong, carrying what seemed like entire stores in their pockets. Rations in cans, chewing gum, chocolate, spare ammunition, photographs of women, even explosives. Everything they needed, carried by every man. At 00:30 hours, General der Artillerie, Erich Marx, received his first clear report. He commanded the 84th Corps, responsible for the entire invasion sector, and he was sitting in his command post when word came through. American paratroopers were landing between Santa Maria d'Umo and Santa Maria Iglesias. Marx was 53 years old, missing a leg from fighting on the Eastern Front, walking now on a prosthetic limb. He understood military operations with the clarity of a man who had survived the Russian campaign. But something wasn't right about these reports. The paratroopers seemed scattered, chaotic. There was no clear tactical focus. German doctrine, shaped by their own airborne operations, assumed paratroopers would mass on specific strategic targets. These Americans appeared to be everywhere and nowhere at once. Marx made a decision that would cost his forces dearly. He ordered Kampfgruppe Armaya, pulled from the 915th Grenadier Regiment south of Carentan, to investigate the scattered reports of American landings. The column moved out into the darkness, racing through narrow Norman lanes, chasing phantoms and rumors. They would spend the entire night and much of the morning navigating those twisting roads in complete darkness, pursuing intelligence that proved false or wildly exaggerated. By 0700 hours, when they finally received accurate information about where American forces actually were concentrated, they were exhausted, turned around multiple times, and 20 miles away from the places they needed to be. The window for a decisive counterattack had slammed shut. The German command structure was fragmenting by the hour. General Oberst Friedrich Dollmund was conducting a war game exercise with his division commanders, running through scenarios about how to respond to an Allied invasion of Normandy. The exercise felt academic, theoretical, removed from reality. But reality was already crashing down outside the headquarters walls. At approximately 0400 hours, General Wilhelm Falli made the decision that would end his life. He had heard aircraft engines roaring overhead from the headquarters he was visiting. Without hesitation, he decided to race back to his command post to take direct control. His staff car accelerated through the darkness outside Château de Bernaville. Then came the patrol. Soldiers from the 82nd Airborne Division dug in and waiting. Lieutenant Malcolm Dodge Brandon of the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment saw the car approaching and fired. General Falli fell. He became the first German general to die on D-Day. The German communications network began failing almost immediately. Radio connections between units died first, replaced by hissing static and silence. Telephone lines, those carefully laid cables connecting the command structure, went dead one by one as paratroopers encountered them in the darkness and cut them. Oberleutnant Martin Dietrich, communications officer for the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, later recalled the growing nightmare. Nothing worked. The radios produced only noise. They learned later the Americans were jamming every frequency. The telephones were cut in dozens of places. In desperation, Dietrich tried the French civilian telephone network. Remarkably, it functioned. It seemed the resistance had qualms about damaging French state property. German radar stations from Cherbourg to Le Havre had been systematically jammed beginning at 2300 hours on June 5th. The primary Luftwaffe radar station at Douvres-Delivrance would have its antennas destroyed by naval gunfire at dawn. From England, fixed transmitters broadcasting under code names like bagpipe and chatter flooded German radio frequencies with electronic noise. The Wehrmacht's intelligence service might have provided warning, but Hitler himself had abolished the Abwehr in February 1944 after discovering its chief, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, had been involved in activities against the Nazi regime. The service had been absorbed into the SS security apparatus, where political loyalty mattered far more than actual competence. Major Friedrich von der Heydter, the aristocratic commander of Fallschirmjäger Regiment 6, began his own investigation as dawn approached. He was a veteran of Crete, where German paratroopers had suffered devastating losses. That experience had made him understand airborne operations better than perhaps any other German officer in Normandy. At 600 hours, he began personally interrogating captured American paratroopers in Carentan. What he discovered shook him to his core. These were not commandos on a raid, these were full divisions. The 82nd and 101st Airborne. Later, writing in his memoirs, von der Heydter reflected on what impressed him most. The Pathfinders particularly caught his attention. They had shaved their heads except for a thin stripe running down the middle, what they called a mohawk, and they had painted their faces with green and brown camouflage. When another German officer, Hauptmann Tripes, saw them, he muttered dismissively, "Now they're sending us their Indians." Each American paratrooper was carrying between 70 and 120 pounds of equipment. Their main parachutes were supplemented by reserve chutes, a luxury German paratroopers had never experienced. They carried the M1 Garand semi-automatic rifle, capable of firing 8 rounds as rapidly as a soldier could pull the trigger. Most German infantry still carried the bolt-action Kar 98K rifle, designed in an earlier century. Every single American had multiple flashlights with spare batteries. Each carried morphine syringes for immediate pain relief. Their rations contained not just food, but cigarettes, chocolate, and chewing gum. Even cricket clickers were issued to every man, small metal devices for identification in darkness. One German soldier dismissed the idea contemptuously, noting that this notion of Americans needing to communicate in the dark with children's toys wasn't particularly intelligent. He failed to comprehend what it really meant. Only a nation with truly unlimited resources would issue such devices to every single soldier. The assault on Saint-Mère-Église demonstrated the ferocity and speed of the American attack. This small town of 2,500 people sat astride Route Nationale 13, the main road from Cherbourg to Carentan, making it absolutely crucial for any German counterattack. The German garrison consisted of just 41 men from the 91st Division, reinforced by conscripts from Eastern Europe whose loyalty was questionable at best. They had 2 anti-aircraft guns and a handful of machine guns. At 04:30 hours, Lieutenant Colonel Edward Krauss led his 3rd Battalion of the 500th Parachute Infantry Regiment into the town with just 30 to 40 men, all he could gather from the scattered drop zones. By 0500 hours, Krauss had raised the American flag over the town hall. The German garrison dissolved, 30 men captured, 11 killed. Throughout June 6th and 7th, German units from positions near Fauville, 2 kilometers south, launched repeated counterattacks. These assaults, supported by concealed 80 mm anti-tank guns, turned the southern approaches into a slaughterhouse. Between 08:30 and noon on June 6th, First Lieutenant Richard Winters led what would later be taught in military academies as a textbook example of small unit tactics at Bricourt Manor. The German position consisted of 4 105 mm howitzers, manned by approximately 60 soldiers from the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment. Reinforcements from the elite 1st Battalion had arrived to find the original garrison had abandoned their posts. Winters commanded just 17 men initially, eventually reinforced to 24. Using fire and maneuver, the Americans systematically destroyed each gun emplacement. The assault revealed an intelligence prize, a complete map case showing every German position in the Cotentin Peninsula. Winters paid with 4 dead and 6 wounded. German losses included 15 killed, 12 wounded, and 23 captured. Lafayette Bridge, spanning the Murderet River, would witness what military historian S.L.A. Marshall would later call probably the bloodiest small unit struggle in American combat experience. A company of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment reached the bridge first, securing it by 0900 hours on D-Day. The German counterattack came at 1600 hours. Elements of the 157th Grenadier Regiment arrived, reinforced by 3 captured French light tanks. The Germans used captured American paratroopers as human shields, forcing them to walk ahead of the tanks. Fighting around Lafayette continued for 3 days. A company suffered an 86% casualty rate, 46 killed and 81 wounded from 147 men. The 91st Luftlander Division lost over 2,200 men in the first 6 days of fighting around this single bridge. German intelligence had completely failed to detect the creation and training of the American airborne divisions. The 82nd and 101st Airborne had been conducting massive exercises in England for over 2 years. The assembly of 820 C-47 transport aircraft went entirely unnoticed. Even the distinctive black and white invasion stripes painted on all Allied aircraft escaped German detection. German expectations for airborne operations were shaped by their own doctrine. They assumed paratroopers would drop relatively far from beaches, targeting strategic objectives deep behind the lines based on their operations in Holland and Crete. They could not imagine that the Allies would use airborne forces as super infantry, dropping them just miles behind beaches to secure the immediate beachhead. The 91st Luftlander Division had been specifically moved to Normandy in May 1944 to counter expected airborne assaults. The 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment had been attached precisely for their anti-airborne expertise. Yet despite keeping one-third of their troops in constant readiness, day and night in potential landing zones, they were caught completely unprepared when the assault came. Operation Titanic had deployed 400 dummy paratroopers, 3-foot-tall Hessian cloth figures equipped with explosive charges and little noisemakers simulating rifle fire. These fakes successfully diverted the entire 915th Grenadier Regiment away from the beaches. The unit spent critical hours searching through woods for phantom paratroopers instead of racing to the invasion beaches where they were desperately needed. Field Marshal von Rundstedt ordered the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend to deal with supposed parachute landings near Lisieux that consisted solely of these dummies. This elite unit, which could have made a real difference at Omaha Beach if committed early, instead spent the day searching for enemies that didn't exist. German after-action reports acknowledged, in several locations, the paratroopers turned out to be puppets with explosives inside their crates. The goal, they noted, was to divide local reserves and pull them away from their crucial positions. As dawn broke on June 6th, German soldiers confronted the technological chasm separating them from their enemy. American paratroopers carried SCR 536 handy-talkie radios, enabling communication at the squad level. German infantry relied on runners or signal flags. Americans had M1 Garand rifles with 8-round clips. Most Germans carried bolt-action rifles designed in the 1890s. The medical equipment astonished German soldiers. Every American carried sulfonamide powder and morphine syringes. American medics carried blood plasma that could be administered immediately in field conditions. The K-ration packages that arrived with American forces contained items that seemed like pure fantasy to hungry German soldiers. Canned meat, hard crackers, chocolate bars, cigarettes, chewing gum. Treasures that represented a world of plenty to men who'd grown accustomed to black bread and ersatz coffee. Werner Kortenhaus, serving with the 21st Panzer Division and fighting British paratroopers near the damaged bridges, would later remember those first moments of shock. His reflection carried the weight of bitter realization. We were still a horse-drawn army pretending to be modern and mechanized. But the Americans and British weren't pretending anything. They represented something fundamentally different. A truly mechanized fighting force. When Kortenhaus watched American paratroopers smoking cigarettes endlessly, eating chocolate while under fire, treating their wounds with medicines that hadn't been available since 1942, the truth crashed over him with crushing certainty. The war was already lost. The German armored response that followed only confirmed this, revealing a command structure in complete collapse. The 21st Panzer Division stood as Germany's only immediately available armored unit, yet it couldn't move a single tank until noon on D-Day itself. The reason was extraordinary and damning. Hitler had insisted on personal control of all panzer movements, and on this critical morning he was sleeping at his mountain retreat in Berchtesgaden. His staff, paralyzed by fear, wouldn't dare wake him. Only when General Major Edgar Feuchtinger finally received permission to attack at 1620 hours could the division move, but by then units were scattered across Normandy, sent in different directions, chasing reported paratrooper landings that turned out to be diversions or confusion. When his tanks finally assembled and rolled toward the beaches, the damage was catastrophic. Of the 124 tanks that began the assault, 70 lay destroyed or disabled by the day's end. Naval gunfire stopped them, fighter bombers screamed down from above, paratroopers with bazookas harassed them relentlessly. American tanks hadn't even arrived in significant numbers yet, but the German armor was being shredded regardless. Throughout D-Day, German units found themselves fighting in increasing isolation, cut off from each other, unable to coordinate. That morning at 10 o'clock, General Marx addressed his division commanders with desperate urgency. "The fate of Germany and this entire conflict depends on your counterattack," he told them. The words carried enormous weight, but they couldn't overcome the practical reality on the ground. Orders took hours to reach frontline soldiers. Some never arrived at all. The German doctrine that had always encouraged initiative from junior officers collapsed completely when those officers had no idea what the actual mission was supposed to be. Without clear communication from higher headquarters, units attempted three things simultaneously: attacking beaches, hunting paratroopers, and holding existing positions. They accomplished none of them effectively. Major Friedrich Haller's 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment became a perfect example of this breakdown. His regiment was scattered across 30 square miles of terrain. The 1st Battalion was destroyed while trying to pull back toward Carentan. The 2nd Battalion found itself pinned down near Saint-Côme-du-Mont. The 3rd Battalion simply vanished from the map. Haller wouldn't discover until after the war that they'd been surrounded and captured almost intact, hundreds of men taken prisoner without firing more than a few shots. The chaotic nature of the paratrooper drops became a strategic advantage almost by accident. Only 1 in 6 American sticks landed anywhere near their intended drop zones, and some jumped as much as 20 miles from their objectives. But instead of concentrating German defensive efforts against tight clusters of paratroopers, the Americans were suddenly everywhere. The dispersion forced Germans to fight scattered engagements across their entire rear area. German intelligence, piecing together reports from the field, estimated that between 20 and 25,000 American paratroopers had somehow landed on French soil. In reality, the number was less than half that. 13,348 men actually jumped. But those scattered paratroopers possessed something German soldiers didn't. They attacked whatever Germans they encountered with an aggressiveness born from excellent training and from knowing that safety existed only in victory. This combination convinced German commanders they were facing an invasion force far larger than reality. The psychological weight of fighting an unseen enemy of supposedly massive size affected decision-making at every level. By noon on D-Day, Germans had managed to capture several hundred American paratroopers. Interrogations of these prisoners revealed something that shattered German assumptions. These weren't special commandos on a limited raid. They were the advanced guard of something vastly larger, an invasion involving millions of men. Feldwebel Ernst Wagner, assigned to guard prisoners near Carentan, wrote in his diary about their unshakable confidence, their certainty that they would ultimately prevail. He noted something that haunted him. These young Americans, even when wounded, received medical treatment with plasma, morphine, and sulfadiazine drugs that hadn't been seen in German field hospitals for more than a year. The contrast was stark and demoralizing. On the eastern flank, the British 6th Airborne Division operations proved equally devastating to German plans. Landing 8,500 men by parachute and glider, they seized crucial bridges crossing the Orne River and the Canal. Major Hans von Lüttwitz commanded a Kampfgruppe from the 21st Panzer Division and received reports of the landings at 0130 hours, but he couldn't get permission to attack until 8 hours later. By the time his force moved, British positions were already consolidated with naval gunfire support standing ready to defend them. The glider assault on Pegasus Bridge stunned everyone defending the area. 6 gliders touched down within yards of the target. Troops poured out and seized the bridge in less than 10 minutes. The German guards, positioned miles behind what they believed was the front line, were completely surprised. What chance did they have against paratroopers landing practically on top of them? Major von der Heiter's post-war analysis captured German respect for their opponents with stark honesty. The caliber of the American paratroopers who fought against us was outstanding. They were excellently trained in combat techniques. Their armament and equipment were first class. In our opinion, the American 101st Airborne Division, and particularly its 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, surpassed the other American airborne units. German paratroopers particularly noted one thing that distinguished Americans from their own soldiers. American paratroopers thrived in chaos. When confusion erupted, when plans fell to pieces, they simply formed ad hoc groups and attacked targets of opportunity. German Fallschirmjäger, by contrast, trained to follow detailed plans precisely. When those plans collapsed, they often became paralyzed, unable to function without explicit orders. The statistics tell the story of what actually took place. 822 Americans filled 47 transport aircraft. 13,348 American paratroopers jumped into France. 3,937 more arrived by glider. 8,500 British and Canadian airborne troops came down behind German lines. The total Allied airborne strength stood at approximately 25,785 men. German casualties during that first week were staggering for elite units that couldn't be replaced. The 91st Luftlandedivision Division suffered 8,000 casualties from a force of 12,000 men, a 67% loss rate that was simply catastrophic. The 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment lost 3,000 from 4,500, another 67% casualty rate. Various other units absorbed approximately 5,000 more casualties. The total reached approximately 16,000 German casualties directly caused by the airborne operations. These losses among elite units represented something Germany couldn't absorb. The nation lacked both the training infrastructure and the transport aircraft needed to create new airborne forces quickly. American losses, though heavy at 2,499 casualties on D-Day alone, were replaced within weeks. New paratroopers arrived, new transport planes were delivered. American industrial capacity simply overwhelmed German production. Tactically, the D-Day airborne operations had appeared mixed at best. Units missed their drop zones. Casualties ran heavy. Many objectives weren't achieved on schedule, yet strategically they succeeded completely. They prevented effective German defense of the invasion beaches. They paralyzed German decision-making during the critical first 48 hours when German counterattacks might have pushed the Allies back into the sea. General Heinrich Eberbach, who would later command Panzer Group West, wrote this assessment after the war. The Allied airborne operations on D-Day were decisive. Though not in the tactical sense, many objectives weren't achieved immediately. But operationally and strategically, they prevented us from implementing our defensive plans. German intelligence had failed catastrophically. The creation of American airborne divisions, their 2-year training programs, the assembly of transport aircraft, even the painting of invasion stripes on those aircraft, Operation Fortitude's deception had proven so successful that 150,000 German soldiers remained positioned in the Pas-de-Calais region until late July, waiting for an invasion that never came. Colonel Alexis von Roen of Foreign Armies West had provided accurate assessments before D-Day, but Hitler and the High Command dismissed his reports in favor of their own preconceptions. The impact extended throughout the entire remainder of the war. German forces remained fixated on airborne threats, holding reserves back from France to guard against hypothetical paratrooper landings. When the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich received orders to move north from southern France as reinforcement after D-Day, the journey took 2 weeks, a trip that should have required only 3 days. Resistance attacks and constant fear of paratroopers delayed them at every turn. Operation Market Garden in September 1944, despite its ultimate failure, confirmed German fears by dropping 3.5 divisions in broad daylight. This caution, born from D-Day's shock and surprise, contributed substantially to the speed of the Allied advance across France. Normandy's airborne operations represented something more profound than simply military tactics. They showed the democratization of elite military capability. German Fallschirmjäger were carefully selected volunteers, many from aristocratic families with long military traditions stretching back generations. American paratroopers were citizen soldiers. Farm boys, factory workers, students who volunteered for an extra $50 monthly jump pay. Yet these Americans, these civilians in uniform, outfought professional warriors who possessed years more combat experience. They fought not for glory or ideology, but to finish a job and go home. Francois Gockel, the teenage machine gunner from Omaha Beach, who would later emigrate to America, spoke to military audiences about what the paratroopers meant. We were prepared to defend our beaches, but when we heard paratroopers were behind us, everything changed. Were we surrounded? Should we retreat? Your paratroopers won the battle before the first landing craft reached the beach. Erich Bismarck, participating in 2014 reconciliation meetings decades later, remembered the moment vividly. I saw with my own eyes how they jumped straight into our positions. They appeared everywhere. It was terrible for the poor soldiers on the ground who had to face them. As night fell on June 6th, German forces faced a fundamentally transformed battlefield. Field Marshal von Rundstedt's evening report to Hitler captured the situation perfectly. The enemy has succeeded in creating considerable confusion in our rear areas through extensive airborne landings. The scale and coordination exceed our previous estimates of enemy capability. Hitler, utterly unmoved, blamed commanders for lacking will and refused to release reserves. He remained convinced the main attack would come at the Pas de Calais. On June 7th, the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division spent the entire day clearing what were supposedly paratrooper assembly areas, instead of counter-attacking the beaches where the real invasion was consolidating. By the time they were ready to fight, Americans had established inland positions that couldn't be dislodged. The critical moment had passed. Major von der Heydte, writing after the war for professional military journals, provided the definitive assessment of what happened. The American airborne assault on D-Day represented far more than a military operation. It demonstrated a new form of national power, the ability to project force vertically, to transform civilian youth into elite soldiers, to coordinate complex operations across vast distances, and to sustain operations through industrial production. We Germans considered ourselves masters of modern warfare. We invented blitzkrieg, we pioneered airborne operations. We developed combined arms tactics, but Americans had industrialized all of this. They democratized it. They deployed it on a scale we never imagined possible. 13,000 paratroopers shattered our conception of what was militarily possible. They proved that democratic nations could create forces equal to any authoritarian regime, that citizen soldiers could match professional warriors, that industrial production could overcome tactical skill. In the darkness between June 5th and 6th, 1944, we heard hundreds of aircraft engines. We saw thousands of parachutes blooming across the sky. We fought scattered groups of determined young Americans, and we learned that our 1,000-year Reich had challenged forces beyond our comprehension. The vertical development of Normandy proved something fundamental. The arsenal of democracy had created a new form of warfare that authoritarian regimes could neither match nor defeat. German soldiers learned this truth through defeat, through fighting an enemy they'd been taught to despise. As dawn broke on June 7, 1944, German defenders faced a completely transformed battlefield. Behind the Atlantic Wall, American paratroopers controlled key terrain, disrupted communications, and prevented coordinated response. The Germans hadn't anticipated that nearly 13,000 American paratroopers would land behind their lines. When they did, those young soldiers brought the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany and the dawn of American military supremacy in the modern age.